paper, The Embodiment of a Plural Pragmatist. Richard Bernstein was an open-minded thinker who had a deep affinity with John Dewey's vision of experience and nature. He prided on being a philosopher in the tradition of pragmatism and very much a public intellectual concerned with radical democracy. He was also a full human being whose curiosity and kindness were among the best features of his pluralistic, open-minded understanding of life, whose prints are indelibly engraved in this great institution he so fiercely loved, the New School. As a young academic at Yale, Dick was concerned that the analytical philosophers who had rejected the American pragmatist tradition were gaining territory in the academy. He was certainly not against all of them, just those who scorned the legacy of pragmatism, especially its focus on experience and the role of imagination. He studied with Hempel and Sellars and eventually became the editor-in-chief of Paul Weiss's journal, The Review of Metaphysics. His career path took him through Chicago and Yale, then to Harvard, and finally to the New School, an institution that he gave his heart to, primarily because John Dewey was one of its founders. His strong views on pluralism molded his character not only as a philosopher, but also as a mentor of the many people he met along his academic journey. Dick had such a large group of friends because he found the best in each one of them. He had no prejudices about those he worked with and taught, no touch of meritocracy or elitism, either intellectual or of any other kind. He approached his colleagues, friends, and students with the same open-hearted way. Jürgen Habermas once told me that Dick Bernstein was his first US friend. Stored in my mind is the beautiful story Dick told me about that visit, which occurred when Habermas first came to visit him at Haverford. Horace Keelan, a student of William James, sort of made public the term cultural pluralism and defined it as related to the great territory for learning about the coexistence among different religions and ethnic groups, and he saw there many intellectual differences as sources of enrichment that must be respected and preserved. Dick understood this point very well. As we will see, this is an important source, and it is one of the many reasons Dick so admired the work of Charles Taylor. The pragmatists, Dick claimed, were not sentimentalists or naive, but quite the opposite. They objected to the abuses of unrestrained capitalism. Moreover, they knew that the American ambivalence about diversity and difference was hard to combat in a country that owes so much to those who had been dispossessed, enslaved, or famished. Dick had been involved in some of the important moments in the struggles for civil rights, and he claimed, and I'm quoting him, that being a freedom rider in the 1960s in the segregated American South was a seminal experience in my life. Bernstein often observed that Dewey helped found the NAACP, the leading institution to defend the rights of African Americans. Dewey, like many pragmatists, was deeply involved in teaching at community centers, and this might be one of the many reasons Dick Bernstein remained at the New School, the institution which for him had such a strong relationship with the fate of emigres, refugees, and now cosmopolitan students and professors from the world over. He concluded many of the comments on the pragmatists with this, also quotes. Because of their deep commitment to the plasticity of human beings, the cultural pluralists argue that a democracy becomes more vigorous and robust when it benefits from the contribution of different cultural, ethnic, religious, and racial groups. Oh, certainly, Dick involved himself in academic politics because of his awareness of the extraordinary role the New School had played in supporting freedom and diversity in very dark times. Dick admired the work of Charles Taylor and what he called his engaged fallibilistic pluralism. He argues that Taylor was against taking extreme positions that, quoting him, distorts and obscures the real social, political, and personal problems that we confront. He also noted that one of Taylor's most important contributions came from a position he had taken on behalf of the French Canadians about protecting cultures that could disappear because of a lack of institutional support. Dick praised Taylor's theoretical and political stand, agreeing with him that seemingly incommensurable problems with respect to cultures, religions, politics, and moral behavior should not be seen as imposing, and quoting him, rigid epistemological or metaphysical barriers, except when those views are themselves exclusionary and intentionally cruelly provocative. Indeed, what Dick describes as Taylor's major virtue is his contention that we must allow ourselves to be challenged by what is genuinely different. Certainly, Dick's commitment to pluralism was not one-dimensional. As I have said elsewhere, Carlos Pereira wrote an essay that described Dick as a bridge thinker, meaning bridge builder. Even if this metaphor could have quite aptly sum up Dick's plural interests, Dick rejected it as a description of his work, as he felt it failed to reflect the objections he might articulate when asked after reading the work of a fellow philosopher. I will return to this issue later. My point here is that he was so careful to note the gaps or weaknesses, even the failures in the manuscripts he was asked to comment on, because he believed in the necessity of thoughtful balance and critique. Even so, he was always careful to acknowledge the strengths of someone else's arguments. His criticisms were always balanced, critical, and diverse. For example, he used the title of one of his books, Beyond Objectivism and Relativism, as a way of making the same argument that he used when describing Taylor's work. That is, quoting, playing off the strengths and weaknesses of Gadamer, Habermas, Rorty, and Arendt, he said, I show how an underlying common vision emerges, one that illuminates the dialogical character of our human existence and our communicative transactions, and that points to the practical need to cultivate dialogical communities. Yes, better than bridges, he built communities. The starting point is that he built dialogues between pragmatists and hermeneutics, between Habermas and Derrida, long before each other got to respect one another, between Arendt and himself, or between Dick Rorty's work and his own. More than that, he wanted to make clear that he took the task of offering critique of a fellow theorist's work as the most serious way to show respect. In his essay, Richard Rorty's Deep Humanism, Dick Bernstein tells us that the two met at the University of Chicago in 1949. Rorty had entered the university at age 15 and was already working on his master's degree in philosophy. They both went from Chicago to Yale for their PhD, and they remained close friends until Rorty's death in 2007. Bernstein said, no other philosopher has influenced me in such a creative manner. As I developed my own interpretation of pragmatism, I felt frequently I was addressing Rorty directly or indirectly, seeking to meet his penetrating challenges. Some of our disagreements were quite sharp, but they were always productive. He goes on to describe Rorty's brilliant career and how he went through some bumpy patches, like the one in his philosophy and the mirror of nature, where he ended up describing what he thought of the possible aftermaths of the end of philosophy. Dick avowed that Rorty's pragmatism was idiosyncratic and controversial, and he claimed that it was not until achieving our country that Rorty really found his strength and voiced it with such eloquence. Quoting him, he always saw Emerson, Whitman, and Dewey as the poets and prophets of a progressive, liberal, democratic society. He chided some theorists about the excesses of the New Left, especially the legacy of the cultural left, which disdain anything resembling real politics and dealing with real economic injustices. But he praised the new left for fostering the cultural politics of feminist, gay and lesbian movements. He called for a reconciliation of the reformist old left with its primary emphasis on economic injustice and inequality with the best legacy of the new left. End of quote. Dick acknowledged that Rorty was among the first of the very few philosophers awarded the MacArthur Genius Award, and he saw how he came across as provocative in some of his writings because he used strong negative connotations to shock his philosopher opponents rather than following the canons of argumentation that analytic philosophers are trained with. Bernstein's best defense of Rorty came about when Jonathan Lear called Rorty's banal irony. Bernstein saw how, I'm quoting him, something else was going on Rorty's life, especially during the 1970s. He began questioning what it even means to be a philosopher. He was radically questioning the very idea of philosophy as an academic discipline. He resigned from Princeton and joined the faculty of the University of Virginia as a professor of humanities in 1982, and he never again joined a philosophy department. He was not banal. Bernstein concludes, although Rorty, with his superb intelligence, is a master of the irony quip, I'm quoting again, irony is not merely a rhetorical trope, but rather a proposal of how we, or some of us, might live our lives. And he was right. Rorty was one of the few philosophers who was capable of not being only a brilliant thinker, but a brave revolutionary pragmatist. Another colleague friend whose work Bernstein had great respect for was his one-time student Nancy Fraser. He began his essay called From Socialist Feminism to the Critique of Global Capitalism by saying that, quoting, Fraser, like Marx, engages in constant critique of their work, their own work. This comparison, this is me of course, is not trivial or arbitrary, quite the contrary. First, Dick declares that she keeps adjusting her theories as she covers more increasingly complex philosophical moments. A major turn occurs when she says goodbye to some of her earliest ideas about the public sphere, not rejecting them, but questioning the need to recast them theoretically. As they put it, she engages with issues that have led us into completely different world scenario. At this point, Dick stops and seems to address the reader. After all, with the talk of globalization and transnationalism, we still live and act within the territorial states. But nevertheless, we need to recognize the blind spot of the original theoretical formulation of the public sphere theory, the failure to take account of the epochal developments that call into question the Westphalian frame. End of quote. He then claims that these are hard issues and sees not much guidance on Fraser's own work. Following Fraser's work then, Dick focuses on how redistribution and recognition and political representation and critique were the conceptual elements that were already leading to a reconsideration of Marx's theory. In doing this, she identifies herself as needing to articulate praxis in a new way. With her conception of participatory parity, he says, she dealt with the difficulties of overcoming the institutionalized economic inequality and the cultural status of hierarchies that are embedded in a capitalist society. Rethinking the whole paradigm, along the critique of Karl Polanyi's account in The Great Transformation, led her to claim that it was not enough to champion the social protection of Polanyi's double movement, as social protection and the re-embedding of the market are not sufficient measures to tame capitalism's cannibalism. She went on into adding a triple movement as an analytical device for parsing the grammar of the social struggle in a capitalist society, towards enlarging and historicizing Marx's own conception of emancipation. And Dick adds that emancipation can no longer be taken as a single, all-inclusive paradigm for everything, since Fraser will provide us with new categories. Thus, he explains Fraser's three-act drama: a return to the economic concerns in Act 1, mediated by the recognition of multiple sins of capitalism in Act 2, and finally, in Act 3, the destruction of capitalism made possible by the coming together of feminists recovering the dimension of care with other anti-capitalist social movements, such as ecological and the immigrants and refugees. Indeed, according to Dick, the tripartite movement will evolve into a multidimensional critique of capitalism and a new formulation of the concept of institutional orders, thereby ending the parallel path of similarities between Marx's and Fraser's own journey. This is an extraordinary essay, and the fact that he saw Fraser's work as only an outline makes it no less significant. Indeed, Dick described Fraser's as an extremely impressive achievement because it focuses on the imminent potentialities of the continuing crisis in capitalism. Dick had taken an important critical stand in showing his multidimensional approach to pluralism by pointing out how other prominent thinkers, including Judith Butler, Simon Critchley, Jacques Derrida, Slavoj Žižek, and Julian Rose, had misconstrued and distorted Walter Benjamin's essay on violence, weighing it in on the side of Benjamin's elusiveness, reading into it various versions of support for their own peers. In one masterly essay, he unlocked Walter Benjamin's opaque work, Critique of Violence, to conclude that its value lies in the fact that, I'm quoting him, opens up and compels us to confront questions that still haunt us, and not in any answers or solutions that he provides, because he doesn't provide answers. I read Dick's thoughts about his essay in Violence, Thinking Without Answers, one of my favorite books, which I had an ample opportunity to discuss with him. He said that we are living in one of the most challenging times, and that our task is to go further in our thinking about violence and cruelty, two of our most challenging issues, bravely without any banister. I will end up here by offering my explanation of why Dick was against the description of his philosophy as a bridge building. He insisted that no single orientation or approach has a monopoly on philosophical insight. In his words, there are no bridges to build. There is only good philosophy and bad philosophy. Salman Rushdie had said that it is easy to talk to those who have exactly the same views as you. The hard part is seeing whether positions or styles that seem so different could have something of a common point other than their concern for the world and how to remain open to that. Needless to say, the ability to see both the strengths and weaknesses of the fiercely held contradictory ideas was one of his greatest qualities as a human being. He was fiercely interested in other people. He had many friends throughout his long span of life because he loved friendship and built communities the world over, in Latin America, of course, included. And that is why we're here today. With the family he adored and the colleagues who brought him so much joy, honoring him here by undertaking that what was surely his favorite mental and social activity, simply talking. Thank you.
Second speaker, Chiara Bottici, is my colleague here at the New School. She's an associate professor of philosophy and co-director of Gender and Sexuality Studies. She's the author of several books. I will mention only three. Anarcha-Feminism, published this year, 2022. Imaginal Politics, published in 2014, and A Philosophy of Political Myth, 2007. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm not going to read a paper because I didn't want to talk about what Dick has done in the past. I want to take this opportunity for reflecting on what he has been doing in the last few years and on what he wanted to do in the future. First of all, I will speak about two things. First of all, the classes that he wanted to teach, and secondly, about a book that he wanted to write. And I will do this by relying on what I have as a sources and evidences for my thoughts, which are the conversations I've had with him in the last few years and the syllabi from his classes. I should also preface all of this by saying that I think the three things went together in his work. You cannot understand Dick's scholarly work without understanding his friendship. They were all intellectual relationship, and it's clear from the indications of this book, but also from his teaching. And the classroom were really the spaces where he built his books. So first, the classes that he wanted to teach. In the last 3-4 years, he more than once asked me to teach together a class on Spinoza. We've already heard this morning about this shift towards Spinoza, which is a central figure, if not the central figure of the last book on naturalism. I believe the shift towards Spinoza was happening in particular after the conference on Yovel, and so it was a way for Dick to continue that conversation, but it was also particularly intrigued in Spinoza's thinking of the way in which Spinoza managed to combine naturalism and a clear commitment to a philosophy of immanence with a very strange theory that appears on part 5 of the Ethics of the Eternity of the Mind. So here is the intellectual puzzle. How can somebody, in a philosophical system that has been known for being atheist, having gotten rid of God, and all the other presuppositions of the old order, God, the immortality of the soul, the free will, how can it be that this philosophical system ends up in part 5 with the theory of the eternity of the mind? So how can the mind be eternal if there's no immortality of the soul? Spinoza is very clear about that. And I read this proposition that was on his mind and we have been discussing so many times. Ethics 5, proposition 23, it says, the human mind cannot be absolutely destroyed with the human body, but there remains something of it that is eternal. That was at the center of his thinking. He told me that he even had this quotation copied on his desk, along with another quotation of Spinoza, which is the one of the Ethics, where it says that the free man does not fear anything when it comes to death. Okay, so this is for the class he wanted to teach, which I think is a continuation of the book on naturalism. His energies were really so much focused on getting this book published. And now, the essay or book that he wanted to publish himself. While working on the book on naturalism, Dick also started to change the way he taught pragmatism. And before 2020, he has always been teaching pragmatism in 2 classes, one called Classical American Pragmatism, the other called Contemporary Pragmatism. And I could only go back to the years, the last 15 and 20 years, but I suspect the same holds for the years before. But I hope students here who have taken these classes can confirm this. The Classical American Pragmatism focused always on Peirce, James, Dewey, and at times would also add a class on George Mead. And then the contemporary pragmatism focus on Sellers, Rorty, Putnam, Brandom, and Habermas. So you have these two classes that have been offered for at least 20 years, but probably even before. Something happens in 2020. The last class on pragmatism is indeed from 2020 and is still in this form, the classical pragmatism, the three what we call central figure, Peirce, James, and Dewey. Spring 2021, he talks to me and says, I've really changed the way in which I see now pragmatism. And I asked him, so what has been going on? So spring 2021 is this time where he's working on the book on naturalism. I'm working on this book called Anarcha-Feminism, where I put Spinoza's philosophy together with feminist decolonial philosophy. And for those of you who know Dick, he always made fun, both of me and Cinzia, saying, we hired a Spinozist and then we got an anarcha-feminist. We hired a scholar of Plato and then we got a Marxist. And would say this with this typical enjoyment and gusto in life of how you point towards something, but of course he knew that I was working on anarcha-feminism and he knew that Cinzia was a Marxist, and maybe that's the reason why he hired us, as opposed to classical scholars of Spinoza and Plato, respectively. So it's spring 2021. I'm at the moment of sending the book to the publisher where you are really desperate and you start to doubt everything, although you've worked for 10 years on that book, and you're like, does it hold together? And you're like, what am I gonna do? I need somebody to, give me a really good critique and a sense of what I'm doing. And I'm like, who can do that? Dick, of course. I mean, that's where good friends, you can really see them, because it's in the middle of the semester. And you have a deadline, you have to send the book in 3 weeks, and who's going to do it? Read 300 pages in 3 weeks? Well, Dick did it. He read 300 pages, gave me, of course, a lot of criticism, but also told me the book is great, it's going to be your most famous and successful book, exactly what you want from a friend. Then he destroyed me with critiques, but he also said that the book was a great and my most successful one. In return, I've only read 60 pages of the Spinoza chapter in the naturalist book. I also gave criticism. But we began this discussion on how to include in the writing a more expansive view of philosophy. And I think that's where he started to talk to me about how to change his teaching on pragmatism in a way that would also include more the feminist critique to pragmatism and the black critical race theory tradition. So we go, this is the syllabus, the course description from the syllabus from his course American Pragmatism, Spring 2021. This seminar will focus on the writings of 3 classical American pragmatism, Peirce, James, and John Dewey. We will also read selection from Richard Rorty, that's the contemporary pragmatism from the previous classes, and, here is the novelty, black and women writers who were influenced by and or influenced the pragmatic tradition, including Jane Addams, Du Bois, Alan Locke, Ruth Putnam, Cornel Wells, and E. Gloat. So this is the first class that he taught on pragmatism. It was a Lang college, so an undergraduate class. After this class, again, we had a conversation in May 2021. It was for, a celebration of his birthday. A very moving celebration now, retrospectively, because his desire that evening, so we we lit a candle for his 89th birthday was, I hope that we're gonna all be here next year to celebrate my 90th birthday with Carol and the whole of you together. And that indeed happened, but only for one more year. The same evening, he speaks about how illuminating this experience of teaching this class at Lang was, how students were engaged, how his view of pragmatism had changed when, at the moment when he put the three great classical figures in pragmatism in conversation with the feminist critique and the black critical theorist. Spring 2022, we have a new class, also called American Pragmatism. This time he taught it at the graduate level. And the course description reads, this seminar will focus on the writings of three classical American pragmatists, Charles Peirce, William James, and John Dewey. We will also read selection from Richard Rorty and from black and women writers who were influenced by and or influenced the pragmatist tradition, including, and here the novelty, Nancy Fraser, Susan Dillman, Du Bois, Alan Locke, and Cornel West. So it's spring 2022, and we see Dick at this point, almost 90, struggling with the sickness, who is incorporating in his idea of pragmatism all these voices that he had never taught before. And I have a beautiful story that María, his granddaughter, shared with me, where she was asked by Dick to retrieve an article on a radical black feminist pragmatist. And as she went to visit him at the hospital, she brought him a copy of this article along with some pickles. He loved pickles. But because of his health, he was not allowed to eat a whole pickles. So here is this image. Dick, age almost 90, in the hospital, struggling with the sickness, with a very frail body, eating half a pickle because his body cannot tolerate an entire pickle, and still changing his own views on pragmatism, a class that he had been teaching for more than 50 years, and questioning his own philosophical understanding of what really is the tradition that we can say he was most secure in, right? So instead of just closing himself into some certainty from the past, he's there questioning all of them. I don't know what Dick would have done of this new view of pragmatism. In the first discussion that we had about what was coming out of his classroom in spring 2021, he did speak to me about the desire of writing a new book that would include this more expansive understanding of pragmatism. We also discussed the fact that the word a more inclusive pragmatist canon is a misleading one, in the sense that the idea of inclusion implies that there is a center, and that this center is still the center entitled to include or exclude others. Feminists don't need to be included. They were there, they are there, they continue doing their work. So were Cornel West and the other black pragmatists. They were just not included in the canonical understanding of pragmatism. So we discussed a possible title of this book would be Pragmatism Unbound, and we were laughing about it and discussing, and I was amazed. I was really amazed of the power of this man. Already in spring 2021, his health was declining. I remember that evening, just to go from my kitchen to the bathroom, he needed some help, and I live in a very small apartment. But still, he had not yet finished the book on naturalism, was already planning the new book, and was already drawing the most out of the classes that he was teaching. In 1971, Praxis in Action, as Megan reminded us this morning, Dick wrote. The time is right for philosophers to take off the blinders that have prevented them from learning from each other and escape the provincialism that has cramped philosophizing in the recent years. That was 1971. Dick never stopped doing that. Never stopped doing that, even when his body was so frail that he could only eat half of a pickle. The last time I visited Dick was June 7, 2022. His body was even more frail. He talked to me about this essay that he wanted to write, he really wanted to, and we talked about Spinoza. We talked about the eternity of the mind, and now you can put together this idea of the eternity of the mind with a philosophy of immanence. And I reminded him that immanence, from its Latin root, means in manere, to remain. So you can have a philosophy of immanence, that is a philosophy of in manere, and combine that with the idea of the eternity of the mind, because even if the soul is not immortal, even if the body dies, there is something of the work of the mind that we do that does remain. For me, what remains is the teaching of this incredible philosopher, humanity, and the way in which I see this eternity continuing in our immanent world is in all of those who have been taking his classes and sharing his teaching, who will indeed write the book that he has not written, not the book, the essays he has not written, and the classes that he has not taught. Thank you.
I'm going to introduce our third speaker, Lucius Outlaw Jr. He's the Alton Jones Professor of Philosophy at Vanderbilt. Among his publications, I'm going to mention Race and Philosophy, published in 1996, and Critical Social Theory in the Interest of Black Folks, published in 2005.
Special thanks to all of the organizers of this gathering, Scott, for all of your work, for including me in this particular gathering to celebrate the life of Richard Dick Bernstein, which also gives me an occasion to be in the company again of Carol and Daniel and Andrea and Robin Jeffrey. For those of you who don't know, I was a colleague of Dick's at Haverford College. Dick was principally responsible for my coming to Haverford College, and thus for our family being at Haverford. And I went to Haverford to visit for a year and moved away 21 years later. My wife and I went with one son, we left with three. When I shared news of Dick's passing with the family in one of our text messaging chains, I was quite surprised by the response of our three sons. Each of them had a response that had to do with each of their relationship with Dick in a way that of which I wasn't even aware. That each of them, and it was sort of like, they all was like, Dr. B? That's how y'all refer to Dick. But they each had a remembrance of his significance in their lives and were lamenting, Dr. B is gone? Yeah, Dr. B is gone. So, and my wife and I have been together for now almost 53 years. There was a moment at Haverford when I confided in Dick one afternoon that I wasn't sure the marriage was going to work. We were having some real difficulties. Dick became really concerned and immediately offered me a diagnosis of what was problematic. And he was spot on. Because we thought the problem was between the two of us. Dick said, no, that's not your problem. The problem is you have 3 children, 2 in diapers, and you've got 2 professional careers. It's the pressure of these careers. It's not your relationship to each other. And I thought about that, went and talked to Frida about it, and she was like, oh. We are together 53 years now, and I owe a lot of it to, thanks to Dick for helping to reorient us about that. And the Outlaws and the Bernsteins and other folk in that philosophy project were in each other's homes and lives very often, and we, for nearly 20 years that I was there, one of the highlights was each semester deciding on a text to read together for 2 to 3 hours. No business could be conducted at the reads. It was just the reading of the text. And we did that, and one year I had arranged to have a colleague, a philosopher from Kenya, come and visit with us. And Dick said, well, so why don't we read some things on African philosophy this year? And so we did. Now, what I'm going to attempt to do is, for this particular session on philosophy and the pluralist spirit, is first to lay out something from several writings by Dick on pluralism. And then I'm going to make a turn in a way that I hope would open up a line of conversation and possibly even a line of critique of Dick. So that last presentation is both knocks me a bit off stride, but also makes me have to smile and say, damn. You heard me coming before I got here. You were moving in ways that I was going to raise issues about, Dick? Oh, okay, so thank you. So let me see. Across the years of his philosophizing, Dick Bernstein had much to say about pluralism, in writing as well as in conversations and lectures. In preparing for this conversation, I selected 3 of his published writings for consideration. The Varieties of Pluralism, which was the 1985 John Dewey lecture presented at a meeting of the John Dewey Society and published the next year in the American Journal of Education. The second writing, Pragmatism, Pluralism, and the Healing of Wounds, which was a presidential address to the 84th Annual Eastern Division meeting of the American Philosophical Association in December of 1988 and published the following year in the Proceeding and Addresses of the American Philosophical Association. And the third, Cultural Pluralism, which was published in Philosophy and Social Criticism in 2015. And a version of this essay had been presented in 2014 at a seminar in Istanbul on the sources of pluralism, metaphysics, epistemology, law, and politics in 2014. Now to the essays. In the 1985 Dewey lecture, Dick, as he said, returned to his intellectual roots, sort of, because he said it wasn't quite a return, declaring that, quote, everything that I've written since the early 1950s has been infused and informed by the spirit of Dewey, and more generally, by what I take to be the best and most enduring in the pragmatic tradition. End quote. Now, much of Dick's effort in the essay is devoted to setting out the best and most enduring features and resources of what he calls a pragmatic tradition, forged primarily by the articulations of William James, Charles S. Peirce, and John Dewey. Dick draws on these resources to diagnose a then prevailing condition in professionalized academic philosophy that featured the decline and spreading displacement from prominence of analytic philosophy, resulting in what he called the almost chaotic babble of competing voices characteristic of the range of cultural experiences, including education, more generally. Dick distinguished three responses to the condition, and this condition was being characterized in various ways as postmodern, post-this, there were a lot of posts being offered up around there. He distinguished three responses. Some perceived the situation as what he called, quote, a sign of dangerous wave of irrationalism and nihilism. Others delighted, in his words, in the present disorder and see it as liberating us from the exclusion, hierarchies, and blindness of inherited patterns of thought and language. Others, among whom Dick included himself, quote, who think that while we must confront penetrating critiques, nevertheless we can see the present as an opportunity and challenge for reconstruction, the type of reconstruction that Dewey had called for, that is, the Dewey in Reconstruction in Philosophy. Now for Dick, the need for reconstruction of philosophy, not just in philosophy, was acute, according to a penetrating, trenchant diagnosis with much of which Dick sympathized by his University of Chicago schoolmate and thereafter lifelong, very close philosophical friend, Richard Rorty, since professional philosophy in Rorty's judgment had become marginal to what he called the conversation of mankind. The pluralistic babble of voices made for a situation so grave that, quote, the most ominous threat to our everyday life world is the breakdown and distortion of any form of recognizable community life. Those are Dick's words. But Dick was not dismayed. Rather, he was excited. For there were voices raised in affirmation of the value of shared communal life conditioned by human plurality. Hannah Arendt, Hans-Georg Gadamer, Jürgen Habermas, Alistair McIntyre, Rorty, Michael Sandel, and here I want to stop and mark something, because Dick points something out when he refers to the work of Michael Sandel, how members of a society are bound by a sense of community, in large part by conceiving of their identity as defined to an important extent by the community of which they are a part. Now this is Dick saying what one of the important points he takes Sandel to be making. And he articulates this in a way that leads me to think he's embracing what Sandel is saying. That the reason I want to mark this is because I want to come back to this issue about identity. Because there's going to be something else that Dick's going to say that leads me to think this is troubling. It isn't something that he's affirming internally, and that's something I want to raise to talk about. Now, all of these thinkers of import, each of them important to Dick's own philosophizing, endeavor to embrace some conception of plurality, of ideas, persons, peoples, cultures, as essential to understanding shared human life, as needing to be a part of any notion of political life that would be viable for wide embrace by socially, culturally, and philosophically varying persons and groupings, and for understanding a pluralistic universe in the terms of William James. Democracy, democratic praxis, was the best means, Dick was convinced, by Aristotle, Dewey, Gadamer, and others, by which to forge and sustain unified political life shared by diverse persons and peoples. The pragmatic recommendation for best contending with pluralism, in Dick's words, to break out of wild pluralism. What did he mean by that? He said a pluralism in which we are so enclosed in our own frameworks and our own points of view that we seem to be losing the civility, desire, and even the ability to communicate and share with others. To break out of wild pluralism, to cultivate phronesis and reflective intelligence, to learn to listen, speak, and act with others a mutual understanding that can recognize and honor genuine differences. Now, in his 1988 presidential address to the annual meeting of the Eastern Division of the American Philosophical Association, Dick drew on his convictions regarding a U.S.-American pragmatic tradition, and here I just want to mark something else. I'm very deliberate in saying a U.S.-American tradition. Whenever my students write papers and they refer to anything using the term American, I circle it in red and write a question in their paper. Which America? Well, what do you mean, Professor White? I said, we're not going to participate in this hegemonic hijacking of the notion of America when there are many, as though only the United States matters. So I say a U.S.-American pragmatic tradition of philosophical praxis, and once again endeavoring to, in his words, understand and gain a critical perspective on our present situation in philosophy. In this effort, Dick took care to make clear that pragmatism was not for him, quote, a set of doctrines or even a method, unquote, but that what the philosophizings of what, in retrospect, the in many ways diverse key figures had in common were what he called dominant interrelated motifs characteristic of their style of thinking, motifs that Dick characterized as a, quote, pragmatic ethos. There were a number of, what were these characteristics? Self. Anti-foundationalism, fallibilism, the social character of the self and the need for the regulative ideal of a critical community of inquirers, awareness of and sensitivity to radical contingency and chance affecting, quote, the universe, our inquiry, our lives, unquote, plurality. Those were what he said were common characteristics of the styles of thinking of all the, what he saw as the key figures in the pragmatic tradition. Now, returning to his diagnosis of prevailing philosophic problematic conditions in professionalized academic philosophy in fuller fashion than in his 1985 Dewey lecture, Dick concluded, once again, that the situation was ably characterized as, quote, babel, a confusion of tongues, a decentering of philosophy itself. The confusion was not to be celebrated, Dick warned, by a simplistic, uncritical embrace of pluralism. Quoting him, for pluralism itself is open to many interpretations, and we need to make some important distinctions. Fragmenting pluralism, she said, was where the centrifugal forces become so strong that we are only able to communicate with a small group that already shares our own biases and no longer even experience the need to talk with others outside of this circle. What he called flabby pluralism, quote, where our borrowings from different orientations are little more than glib, superficial poaching. Polemical pluralism, quote, where the appeal to pluralism doesn't signify a genuine willingness to listen and learn from others, but becomes rather an ideological weapon to advance one's own orientation. And finally, defensive pluralism, quote, a form of tokenism, where we pay lip service to others doing their own thing, but are already convinced that there is nothing important to be learned from them. Dick's recommendation for what is best in our pragmatic tradition: engaged, fallibilistic pluralism. Quoting Dick, such a pluralistic ethos places new responsibilities upon each of us, for it means taking our own fallibility seriously, resolving that however much we are committed to our own styles of thinking, we are willing to listen to others without denying or suppressing the otherness of the other. It means being vigilant against the dual temptations of simply dismissing what others are saying by falling back on one of those standard defensive ploys where we condemn it as obscure, woolly, or trivial, or thinking we can always easily translate what is alien into our own entrenched vocabularies. Dick went on to affirm the importance of the pragmatic regulative ideal of a community of inquirers as a normative or ethical ideal, best practiced democratically, as of particular import for philosophical practices when diversities of ideas, voices, etc. prevail. Contrary to what prominent proponents of analytic philosophy had asserted and imposed on professional academic philosophy, Dick asserted with a pragmatist confidence that, quote, there are no uncontested decision procedures for adjudicating the claims of rival philosophical orientations. Conflict and disagreement are unavoidable in our pluralistic situations. While taking care of the note that, quote, understanding does not entail agreement, unquote, Dick recommended dialogical balance between and among styles of philosophizing, a balance governed by respect and civility. Finally, the third essay. In his 2015 essay, Cultural Pluralism, Dick ventured beyond a historic confounding situation of plurality in professionalized academic philosophy to a no less historic confounding condition of plurality of ideas, peoples, and cultures in the US-American polity and other polities as well. His agenda was to explore appreciatively the arguments for recognizing and embracing the plurality of cultures constitutive of shared life in the US-American polity that had been advanced by Horace Kalin, who he said was a student of William James and a close colleague of John Dewey, and also by Elaine Locke, in opposition to the idea and ideal of the US-American polity becoming and remaining what was called a melting pot. As Dick recounts developments, in 1908, James gave a series of invited lectures on the present situation in philosophy, unquote, at Oxford University that a year later were published as A Pluralistic Universe. And the audience for those lectures were, quote, two former Harvard philosophy students, Horace Kalin, who was on a traveling scholarship awarded by Harvard, and Elaine Locke, a Rhodes Scholar from Harvard, the very first Negro selected for the prestigious fellowship. Now, by Dick's account, Kalin first made his mark as an advocate for respectfully recognizing and embracing the plurality of cultures and peoples with the 1915 publication of his essay, Democracy versus a Melting Pot, published in The Nation. Years later, in 1956, Kalin, echoing his mentor William James, would elaborate his arguments regarding, quote, the dynamic and changing quality of different cultures, unquote, in his book, Cultural Pluralism and the American Idea. Sharing in what Dick had characterized as a pragmatic ethos, Kalin, too, thought that shared political life, ordered by, quote, democratic, unquote, ideals and practices, would be enriched by cultural differences properly attended to. Kalin's project, Dick recounts, was taken up and enriched with argumentative thoughtfulness by Randolph Thorne, and he goes into an interesting discussion of the work of Randolph Thorne. However, it is of particular importance to me that Dick took care to note that, quote, the cultural pluralists were primarily concerned with the democratic integration of immigrants from Europe and Russia. And then he does this in italics. Not the integration of African Americans. Even by some progressive thinkers. The prevailing prejudice in America during the early decades of the 20th century, even by some progressive thinkers, was that the descendant of slaves really had no distinctive culture. Refusing to be bound by this prevailing prejudice, Dick brought forth W.B. Du Bois, and I'm going to stop here. He renders Du Bois' name incorrect. He brings forth W.B. Du Bois and Elaine Locke, quote, two of America's most significant black intellectuals, end of quote, to include in his account their extension of the idea of cultural pluralism, quote, to include African Americans. Both men, Dick says, quoting him again, studied philosophy at Harvard and were deeply influenced by William James's pluralism. Both became forceful critics of racism in America. Both argued that blacks should take pride in their African cultural heritage. Still, and here's where I hope that we have some serious conversation, during which I hope you colleagues will enlarge my understanding and appreciation of Dick's following through with his philosophizing on his commitments to pluralism. To be noted is that Dick did not engage with any of Du Bois's articulations. He mentions, and he gets the title wrong, the souls of black folk. And he renders it incorrectly. Though he says of Du Bois, quote, all his life he was fully engaged in the political fight to achieve full equality, respect, and dignity for African Americans, unquote. What Dick writes of Du Bois in that essay does not fill a complete paragraph. What if he writes of Alain Locke does, at some length? While noting that Locke gave a set of lectures on race contacts and interracial relations that were published after his death, lectures that, quote, show how advanced his thinking was about the concept of race. Drawing on the scientific work of Franz Boas, Locke argues that there are no fixed factors, biological, sociological, anthropological, or cultural, that determine race. The concept of human plasticity is fundamental for all the pragmatists. In effect, Locke was deconstructing the fixity of the concept of race. Further, he says, Locke, quote, shared with W.B. Du Bois the conviction that African Americans need a positive idea of race in order to achieve a sense of self-esteem, self-respect, and dignity, end quote. Dick goes on to conclude his essay by affirming the importance of the ideal of a, quote, cultural, pluralistic, cosmopolitan society, an ideal that, quote, can guide our praxis. Today, during the first decades of the 21st century, the ideas and ideals of the cultural pluralist still have a fresh and contemporary relevance. They have an even more universal and urgent significance, end of quote. All to the good, Dick. However, I'm reminded of Dick having shared with me what was clearly a most memorable and influential challenge directed at him by an important mentor at Yale, Paul Weiss, who said of both Richards, named Bernstein and Rorty, this is the Weiss quote, you Chicago boys like to swing the bat. When are you going to hit the ball? Dick offered serious considerations of affirmative ideas, even ideals of pluralism, but at least in the 3 essays I surveyed, he did not probe the challenging matters of just how diverse persons, peoples, cultures were to live such that a, quote, cosmopolitan and democratic polity might be made workable to the satisfaction, more or less, of all involved. What might be the terms practically implemented that might foster the achievement of unity in diversity? And given Dick's seeming suspicion regarding what more than a few, even among his close colleagues, objected to as the politics of identity, and this is where I raised the issue about how he seems to be affirming Sandel talking about the importance of identity grounded in a community. There were places in one of the essays where he seems critical of what he calls the politics of identity. And I've always been deeply bothered by the seeming critique of the notion of politics of identity. I need help with that. Right? I've never quite understood what the issue is. I'm unsure then of his regard for Sandel's seeming endorsement of the idea that members of a society are bound by a sense of community, in large part by conceiving of their identity as defined to important extent by the community of which they are a part. Were identities anchored in pragmatist notions of raciality acceptable? I don't know of Dick wading into these vexing waters, even though he was host of a late 90s New School conference on race, and the contributors to that conference were Bernstein, Kwame Anthony Appiah, Robert Bernstein, and myself. My worry too is that when it came to appreciation of thinkers of significance who were not white, it seems as though their significance with Dick had to be by way of their proximity to canonical figures in what he took to be traditions of pragmatism, or to other compelling traditions of thought regarding matters of concern to him that were forged by folks who were European or European American. I appeal to those of you who knew Dick well and know more of his philosophizing than I do. In the words of Marlon Karenga, please rescue me if I'm wrong. And let me hasten to add forcefully that my concern, my disappointment is complicated by my first order experience of nearly 2 decades of collegiate relations and serious friendship with Dick that remain of abiding significance for me, for wife Frida, our 3 sons. It is painful in retrospect that across the years of our friendship, Dick never engaged me regarding the hard work I had taken up of engaging with notions and valorizations of raciality to contribute to the work he highlighted that was a lifelong quest for Du Bois as well as for Alain Locke. I think too that Dick would have benefited from serious engagements with some of the articulations of Du Bois, including The Conservation of Races, was in 1997, The Study of Negro Problems, published in 1998, The Development of a People in 1904, particularly Sociality Hesitant, written in 1905, later published in 2000, in which work Du Bois takes up explicitly the matters of how to best put it, of contingency and pluralism. And he's making the case why sociologists are hesitant to deal with contingency, plasticity, and etc., because they're too busy trying to be scientific. This was written by Du Bois in 1905. 1905. My worry, of which I hope to be relieved by conversing with you colleagues, is that Dick did not follow through on motivation from his pragmatist ethos to listen deeply to others, very thoughtful black others, the better to challenge and inform his own thinking. He swung a bat well in philosophizing about pluralism. When and where did he hit the ball, as it were, following the urging of his friend Richard Rorty to take up the articulations of struggles for recognition and for much, much more by various groupings?
So thank you very much. I'd like to say something in regard to what Charles Taylor just said. I think at this moment in democracy in America, to a lesser extent perhaps in Canada and in Britain, but still to a considerable extent in very large numbers of democracies, it's easy to be pessimistic in the way that Joel was pessimistic this morning about the possibilities of reviving any kind of genuine deliberative democracy. You're completely right when you say that philosophers are partway there and they have to realize that they're not the whole way there. So this is something that when I used to do philosophy of science and socially relevant philosophy of science back in the day, I realized that I couldn't intervene in socially destructive scientific disputes unless I'd done my homework. And here too, and I want to say in sort of rather more optimistic moment, perhaps I'm even more optimistic than you are, there are good examples of people being able to come together from different points of view and talk to one another. One I like is the British Columbia Constitution. Another I like is the Irish movement to repeal the ban on abortion. We can study these examples. We can try to understand what it is that facilitates really genuine democratic conversation. We can try to specify the norms of good discussion. There is much that philosophers can do, I think, in a genuine and practical way to facilitate these kinds of things. Dick did it one way, I think, by showing how various philosophical positions, which one might think of as completely irreconcilable, can be made to talk to one another. So perhaps puts up too quickly, too easily. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. It's such an honor to be here with you and to celebrate Dick Bernstein today. I want to raise a point that connects what Charles Taylor just said with what Lucius Outlaw said earlier. That is that, offering opinions without having done our homework is harmful and disrespectful. And this is certainly a time in which all of these different voices that make up the Americas, for example, need to be honored in their specificity. The challenge, of course, is that honoring people, respecting people, isn't just a kind of Kantian abstraction. It requires really doing the work of understanding people's history, gaining a sense of their language, gaining a sense of their mythic structure, their family structures, their hopes, the challenges they find themselves up against now. And so while we're on the right track when we say that pluralism is the only way forward, we need to have a much richer understanding of what our work is as philosophers. And that's going to mean not only intercultural work, but also interdisciplinary work. Because there are a whole lot of people who are going to be necessary to teach us. And at the same time, if Dewey's right and if Bernstein's right, to whom we can offer something valuable in a liaison kind of role. So just to say, with Lucius, we've got to do the cultural piece of the work too. Thank you.
Clearly, I'm getting too old and cranky. I've long ago got really, really tired of hearing academics worry about how to intervene. In part because I find the worry very often steeped in disregard and disrespect. And I mean in the following way. What is to be done question? Where do we intervene? And to me, we're constantly looking out there trying to figure out where out there can we intervene. What I'm regarding as the disregard and disrespect is we are looking over people who are right in front of us. Students.
And social movement.
Well, not just even social movement. We've got people coming before us day after day, year after year, generation after generation. Now, if education is not an intervention in the reproduction of a social order, I don't know what the hell is. There's the point of intervention. There's our point of intervention. It's in our classes and seminars. It's in our teaching. Why do we keep looking for some other place to be when we've got the children of our co-citizens right in front of us, awaiting us to assist them in something called education? Why did Dewey end up focusing so heavily on education in relationship to democracy? Now, if that doesn't make any sense, okay, but you got to convince me it makes no sense. If it don't make no sense, all of us need to give up our damn job. So there is clearly it seems to me, there has been profound miseducation in this country about civic citizenship and democratic responsibility. We've got millions of people, 70 million plus people, believing in utter BS and acting on it. Were they our students? Some of them were. What is it we didn't do? So again, I just want to say, before we try to look out there for points of intervention, that we make sure we're fulfilling responsibilities to the people that honor us by signing up to learn with and from us semester and quarter after. Clearly one of the great legacies of Richard J. Bernstein is manifested in the life of those who were his students. He doesn't have to look anywhere else about making a difference in the world. He did. He did. And people who came into his presence to learn with and from him. It's a profound legacy that stretches all across this country and into other countries. There's a task for us as not just philosophers, but as educators, I think.
I can just add something to this and related to what María was saying, also the social movement. I mean, why also the social movement? Because in comparison to the European education system that at least used to be free when I got it, here it's not free. So there is already a selection in comparison to the larger society, in the sense that those who manage to get to university are already a privileged group. I mean, the cost of higher education.
Depends on the institution.
Yeah, it depends on the institution, but the cost of a higher education is so high that there is already clearly a class and a racial selection that happens, so not everybody comes to our classroom. That's why I think it's also important not only, of course, to look at those we teach every day, but also to keep an eye outside there, in the sense outside of the classroom. I mean, in my case, for instance, what I presented, it's pretty clear that Dick started to teach Black Cornel West, Allen Locke, after 2020. I mean, what happened after that, 2021, 2022? It was the big eruption of Black Lives Matters. So I'm pretty confident in stating that part of our philosophical enterprise and the critical theory is also to be in connection, not just with your own students, but also with the social movement.
Let me just point something out. Right? One of the things that has been noted here, let me give you an anecdote. One of the things that was a point of real solidarity between me and Dick was that I had recounted, we shared something, and that was that in the fall of 1968, I was a sophomore at Fisk University. I was born and raised in Mississippi. I had gone back home for the Christmas, New Year's break, and I had spent part of my time, that break, doing voter registration work in my hometown. And I had mentioned it to Dick, and he says, oh yeah, I was in Mississippi too that December. Now, as I've noted this earlier about Dick going to Mississippi. It was 1968. When did he turn his attention to these black thinkers? Okay, you're talking about social movements, and in fact, we need to be really careful. One, higher education in this country is really diverse. It's really diverse. There are a lot of different kinds of institutions. 3,000 plus colleges and universities in this country. They are really diverse, serving a whole diversity of different populations of people by race, class, ethnicity, gender, region, remain convinced academics have no immediate, special, anything to offer to people forging social movements. If you haven't done the kind of work that Judith is talking about, long before you start trying to do, giving a lecture because we are certified with advanced degrees of reading books and writing articles, doesn't give us some special expertise with people who are forging social movements. I mean, that's a really complicated, messy kind of relationship, right? So, again, to me, it's trying to figure out where can we best be of service and do a certain kind of work, given our training, our commitments as intellectuals and academics. Where can we best be about that? If we're going to be involved with social movement, it may be as persons involved with social movement, but not as PhD professors. That might have to be set aside while you go lick the envelopes and do the knocking on the doors and other kinds of stuff in the social movement. It's not about because you have got a theory about something that's going to be most effective to people out there doing this work in the street.
Unfortunately, we run out of time. Thank you very much. Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at McGill University, recipient of prizes like the Theodor Prize and Bernstein. His many books include Hegel and Modern Society, 1979, Sources of the Self, 1989, A Secular Age, 2007, and more recently, Reconstructing Democracy, 2020. Thank you.
So I rise after a number of other speakers, and there's been a lot of echoing here, but also a slightly different take on some of the things that have been said up to now. So I would say what the remarkable thing about it, one remarkable thing about it, the remarkable thing that comes forward for me is that he put together two qualities. The quality of a philosopher who really contributes some new, genuinely important ideas, and the quality of a philosopher who is really ready to listen to something very new and very different. Because these two qualities run against each other. Let me describe the situation in which we were really contemporaries. We were both brought up in philosophy. The analytic tradition, analytic was very powerful, spreading from Europe and into the Americas, and that was a dominant philosophical tradition. I suppose we both reacted against that, against its narrowness, against its certainty that it comprised everything that any philosopher would need, and we looked to alternative traditions. But the lesson I take from that is that this kind of narrowness is not simply the property of that particular tradition, but they would perhaps push it farther than most. If you have a really good idea, you think it's what really solve problems, you have trouble recognizing that somebody else may, a parallel path, may be doing something very important. The remarkable thing about Dick is he combined these two. You can be someone who is very open and so on, but you don't have a particular vision of your own. And you can have a very powerful vision of your own, but then you have really trouble listening to others. So he combined the two. Now, just what was going on here, I want to give my reading of what I think was going on, holding together these two poles in his life. I think he saw louder, yes, or maybe I can get closer to this microphone. I think he saw, regularly picked up in other approaches to philosophy, something that was very similar, but had similarly wide ranging. And I must confess, I wasn't always. I mean, a particular case in which he picked up an ally was the case of Jacques Derrida, who, some of whose expressions rubbed me the wrong way, I have to admit. But then Dick said, well, just a minute. Here we have a philosopher who has a very profound understanding of like a oppressive possibilities of certain ways of putting it into it. And he sees something that we're not quite seeing. He sees there is a kind of commonality of cause, of direction here, which is worth recognizing. Well, just a minute, why is it worth recognizing? Well, there are really two very important reasons, I think, why he thought it was important to recognize. And there again there's a tension because the reasons are quite different. One reason to recognize that is, if you like, political, that if you want to have the broadest possible alliance in a certain political direction, then you can't go around saying we only go to listen to the justification from this side or from that side or from this form and that form. That's one reason, that's a political reason. But there was an actual, very important philosophical reason, which is that I think he held, maybe I'm projecting something, but I don't think I'm projecting. I think he held that the very richness of human life is only going to be available to us if we can reach out and understand those other ways of looking at it. So this is the notion that difference, plurality is enrichment, potential enrichment. And this, of course, is the, I think, major political problem that we're facing today, is that, if I can now take off into some remarks of our present democracies, we're in a phase in our present democracies where attempts really to open out a pluralism of exchange and mutual recognition have been met with tremendous backlash, set of backlashes in various forms, in various countries, in which, I'll say without mentioning any names, demagogues rise to power on the basis of exclusionary stance towards the other, however the other is defined. Sometimes an outsider wants to integrate, sometimes an insider is considered to be inferior. And in a certain sense, we will only, in, I think, our democracies, win this battle if more and more people, I think this is actually happening among younger generation, if more and more people begin to understand difference as a source of enrichment. And I think that's the second important reason why it was always open to reach out and look at another way of approaching that could have something to teach us, both in the sense of politically strengthening what we want to do, but also in the sense of recognizing again and again that understanding otherness can be enriching. So I'd like to move from this picture of Dick. I hope it's right. It's the one that I take away and that for a long experience of exchange, I've learned from him, because as I said, sometimes he made me recognize something important in another thinker that I'd already written off. He forced me to see that. And I'd like to segue from this into an intervention in the debate or discussion that happened, I think, the last session before, which is the political intervention, possible political intervention of people, qua philosophers, qua academics. And I think that the way I construct it is of the following kind. I don't quite agree in how this issue was presented. Certainly, if you're a professional philosopher or sociologist or one of these particular professions, disciplines, the idea that you can just walk in from a particular specified academic knowledge and make an important intervention which people in the political world should listen to is, in a sense, a little bit absurd, or anyway, more, as it were, a certain element almost of imposture. But if you think what one needs to say something really important and constructive and helpful in our political life today, you discover that, yes, just being a philosopher isn't enough. You have to think through the issues in terms of history, in terms of sociology, in terms of what's known as political science, and somehow put this in a form where you can make a political intervention. Right? So there again, we have the issue of being a philosopher and also a citizen in a polity. And you can see here how you are some of the equipment you need to say something really useful, provided, once again, as a reaching out, provided you're willing enough to, you're willing to inform yourself of the historical, the political, economic significance of what is going on. You can have something important to say. And this is not to say that you have the ultimate answer on anything, but you can have something really important to say. So we come back to, and maybe I'm projecting something of my own feeling about these things, but you say to yourself, I'm also a citizen. And as a citizen, I want to be able to fight for what I think is really important and right. But this is going to require that I fly out beyond my particular expertise. Oh, admit it. But still, starting off from having resolved certain philosophical issues, you're part of the way to developing a really well-grounded proposal. And that, I think, is the way in which people, the kind of profession that we all share today, now, people can make something that, a contribution that wouldn't otherwise be made. Not that they have, in virtue of their academic credentials, all that they need, but that they have a certain element of what they need, and can move out from this in order to interpret the situation in which we are and to give a certain stance. I mean, for instance, if you, I think a very deep intuition which is correct, is that for us, our situation today in the democratic world, is that the more our fellow citizens understand meeting difference, living in plurality as a mode of enrichment, and this is not simply at all simply an intellectual hypothesis. It can be a lived experience. And I see in my own life, in Dick's own life, and I see also in the life of younger people, that this is really an experience. It's not a theory that it's a good idea. It would be nice if it is something that they feel in their life, that the fact that they met such and such people and so on, and they exchange with them, has given them something that they wouldn't otherwise have had as kind of enrichment. So my own judgment is that our way out, if there is a way out of our present impasse in our democracies, comes in the possibility that the younger generation, I think there's some truth to this, there's many more people who have that positive experience of others, and therefore are not easily recruitable into a crusade as it were, targeting some minority or some outside group. And so, with this insight in mind, I think we have a source possibly of hope, but also a possible source of good policies that can hasten understanding of human life. And so that is how I would think of the kind of philosophical insights that Dick had becoming actually highly relevant to the political debate in our societies. And of course, moving out and making them fully relevant and fully effective involves thinking in terms of political, economic, in terms of historical, in terms of the present movements of culture and so on, in terms, as the previous speaker was just saying, in terms of the cultures of the different form that are coming together and understanding them all and seeing them as all having their role. Yeah, all that, it comes in part of it. But I would say, to sum it up, I would say that the kind of approach to philosophy that I partly learned from Dick, and certainly I was strengthened in my adhesion to by the, example of Dick alongside others, that kind of approach and understanding can be an element that gives us a chance in the political struggle that we're in to come to just, anyway, conceive what the solution might be, what the way out might be, and perhaps to find ways and policies to put it into effect. And that's, Dick is a shining example to me of that kind of the philosophical insight